Hi, I'm glad you started to watch this video, because that means you're probably ready to create your first Angular 2 applications. I actually think you're perfectly on time, because Angular got released 2 weeks ago, after 2 quite long and intensive years of development. So let's give a look at our agenda. What we are going to do in this video is we are going to take a look at the core concepts of Angular 2, so just to get an overview such that you know what Angular 2 is all about. Then we will take a look at some tooling, very roughly only. Afterwards, we will use that tooling for generating a new project by using that Angular CLI. That's actually currently the best and fastest way to get started with Angular. We will then develop a simple demo application, and while doing the coding on that application, we will learn about modules, about components, and about templates. Finally, towards the end of the video, I will give you some links and further hints where to go next, so what to learn next and where you can learn it actually. Okay, so let's jump straight into our editor. Now, probably if you're like me, you come from a jQuery background, and there you're usually accustomed to something like this. So we have here our div with an ID message. Then let's create a button. Again, let's give it a button ID. Let's say button say hello. Say hello as a text. And then towards the end of the body tag, you usually have your script, where then we can use jQuery to select our button and to add a click listener here. And then let's select again our message container up there and use the HTML property and say hello, or better, hi there. Great. So as you can see, we have here an existing HTML part where we have some hook points, like here the message ID, or here the button say hello. And then we have a script that reads that part of the HTML and attaches some behavior, like you manipulate it or you add new elements on it. You may also see classes like JS-message container. And here basically we simply use the classes as a hook point, and we usually prefix it, or a best practice is to prefix them with the JS- in order to avoid that designers use those classes for creating a style for our message container in this case. Now this whole setup works quite well in simple scenarios, because it is usually the fastest way to set up some dynamic behavior on your HTML code. But if you build larger and more serious applications, this HTML starts to get messy. First of all, because those elements, as you see them here in our page, in our simple example, they don't communicate very good their actual meaning. So it is very difficult to interpret and say what those elements are going to do, because you see a lot of IDs and classes on it which are used as hook points, and it is difficult to estimate what the elements are going to do. So that's why modern JavaScript frameworks go towards creating what they call web components. So the idea there is to define custom HTML tags which have a certain responsibility. So in our case, it could be to print out a message, and we have some JavaScript code behind the scenes which provides the API for those elements. So it takes those HTML elements and gives them some dynamic behavior. And that's exactly what we're going to take a look now, how we can create such components with Angular 2. So before we start, let's quickly take a look at the tooling. So we will be using the Visual Studio Code Editor for this video. You can get it at codevisualstudio.com. It is available obviously for different kind of platforms, so you can install it for Windows, Linux, and macOS. Next, you will also need to install Nodejs. Nodejs is actually for programming JavaScript on the server side, but we will mainly use it here for our tooling. And with Nodejs, you also get NPM. NPM is a package manager for JavaScript files, and we will use it for importing our external dependencies like Angular and so on. Actually, you can, for instance, search here for a package, let's say Moment, which is a quite popular date library for JavaScript. And here you can see the different kind of libraries with that name, and you can import them into your application. And finally, we'll also use the Angular CLI. The Angular CLI has been specifically made for Angular to help especially newcomers to get started quickly, to build Angular applications that follow the best practices, the style guide, and such that you don't have to care about the whole tooling and bundling. As you can see, we install that using the npm command as we just mentioned. So let's jump into our console and let's input npm install angular CLI -g. -g stands for global, so we will install globally. Now I did that already, so I won't repeat it again. And once you're done with that, we can actually go back for a second onto the Angular CLI website on GitHub. And if you scroll down a bit, you see here a list of things you can do with it. And one of them is also to generate a new project. And that's exactly what we are going to do now. So let's go back. We use the ng command, ng new, and let's call it first ng app. Now what you see now is that Angular CLI creates a scaffold project, so it creates a couple of files and folders, and it also installs the npm packages for us. Now let's switch back and to the Visual Studio Code editor and open that new folder. And here you go. So you now see the structure that got created by our Angular CLI. So this is the scaffold for our Angular application. Now, most modern applications have that package.json file, which might be new for you. So this basically defines some meta properties about your application. So you have the name, like first ng app, then you can have a version and the license, in case also if you publish that back to the npm repository. Further down you have the dependencies. These dependencies are used at runtime by application. So we have here, for instance, the different kind of Angular packages which we import. Further down then we have the dev dependencies, and as the name already tells us, these are used for developing the application. So we have like testing frameworks inside here, toolings like the Angular CLI also. Great, so in a web application usually you first start with index.html page, and surprisingly here this is quite short. So we just have the HTML tag, some meta information, the title. Here we have some strange app root HTML tag, which we'll come to in a minute. But we don't actually see any scripts here. And this is actually quite strange. But what happens is that the tooling which we use for booting our application, so with the Angular CLI, will inject those scripts at runtime. So let's have a look. Let's go back into the package.json, and there you see the script section. And the script section actually contains a series of commands you can execute via npm. Like here, for instance, for starting the application, then for testing, for linting, and so on. So let's try that out. So again here, we can cd first of all into our folder. And then if you use the npm command and like start, we will then execute the ng serve command, which will boot up our application. And so here the Angular CLI basically compiles our whole application, and in the end, when it's done, it will serve it at localhost 4200. So now let's switch back to our editor and browser. And if we input here the URL, we now see app works. So it means that our application booted successfully and it got rendered. Also, if you take now a look at the source code here, so let's inspect here in the browser. Let's move to the body tag, and here you now see the scripts that got injected at runtime. So those which we have missed before. Great. So now if you open the source folder, let's navigate for a second to the main.ts file. This is the file which will actually boot up the application. So what might seem a bit unfamiliar to you, especially if you haven't done any programming with ECMAScript 6 or ECMAScript 2015 as it is called now, is this kind of syntax for imports up there. So this is basically the new way how you import external packages into your application. So on the right hand side you see that string, like here at Angular/platform browser dynamic. And if this is not a path but a name, as in this case, it points to the node modules folder. And the node modules folder is the place where basically those external packages which have been installed via npm get placed. So it will be loaded out from there. And on the left hand side you then see within the curly braces the different kind of functions or classes which you import from that external file. So you don't have to import the entire file, but you can selectively import different kind of pieces. Then finally, further down, you see like the platform browser dynamic function, which we invoke. And on top of that function, we invoke that bootstrap module. And what we pass there is the app module, which, as you can see, gets loaded further up there from the /app folder. So if you open the app folder here, you find an app module file. And that's exactly what we are importing there. And here you see that strange ng module annotation or decorator. So these decorators are used within the Angular application for providing meta information to some kind of class, for instance. In this kind, it is the app module class. This ng module is a way for telling Angular how your module is structured. Like, what are the components within that module? What are the imports which we need in order that that module works? So imports are usually imports from the external side, like here, for instance, the browser module or forms module, or also other modules from our application. And then you also define the exports. So what does that module export to other modules, so basically to the outside? Consider, for instance, the following structure. So we have our first ng app folder, then we have our app folder inside there, and then we can have, for instance, other modules like a people folder or a contact folder. And obviously we have our app module, which defines the different kind of modules within our application. Now, if you open up the people folder, inside there, for instance, we can have a people list component or like a people component in general. And then obviously we also have that module file there for that people component. So it defines what are the components within that module and what gets exported. Similarly, also with the contacts folder or contacts feature. Again, we can have a contacts.module here. And similar as before, we can have different kind of components inside there, like a contact list or as a contact detail. So you also see that the folder structure reflects also the structure of the modules. This is a best practice defined by the Angular style guide. Great. So let's jump back to our app module. You may now wonder what all those components are about. So what is actually a component? Let's take a look. So this is the basic way on how we define a component. And what it is actually the custom elements which we have already seen. So if you jump back to the index.html file, we see there that app root, which was quite strange maybe initially when we took a look here. The app root reflects the selector specified within our component. So a component in Angular is basically the way how you define those custom HTML tags. And you import that component decorator, and there you have different kind of properties. Like here we have the selector or the template URL, which defines how our component gets rendered. And we also have a possibility to add some styles. And there are further properties which we don't see here yet. Then if you open up the app component HTML file, we see actually the HTML structure that gets then rendered when our component gets instantiated. And most importantly, you also here see a first example of a binding. So with those curly braces, we can like take a title property, which is defined on our component class, like here, and couple it to our HTML template. So this is actually what gets rendered out. Great. So I think we're ready to create our first component, right? So first of all, we want to create a new module. And what we can do here within the Visual Studio Code editor is to open up a new terminal. And then we can use the ng command again from the CLI. We can use the generate command, or better even the shorthand is G, then module, and then we call it people. So this should now generate a new people module within our application. And in fact, you see it generates the module file and a couple of components. So let's have a look. We see here the people folder. Then we see a people module here below. This is very similar to what we have seen in our app module. We also have a people component here, same as with the app component. So we have a CSS and HTML template linked. So we are all set up already. So we now obviously want to use that component within our application. To do so, we have to go to the app module and import our people module there. We can use the relative path to the people and people module file. Import the people module. Also very nice how you get the auto completion via TypeScript. And then in that import section, we have to add that people module. Okay. Now, if you jump back to the people component, you see here the selector is app minus people. So if you go into our app component, we obviously have to use that selector. We add app.people, app minus people, and then save our file. And now it should actually get rendered to our application. But strangely enough, here nothing happens actually. So we see a loading like if the application broke up. And in fact, we get an error message. And that's kind of strange because if we go to the people module, we actually defined here the module. We also added the people declaration, but still Angular says app-people is not a known element, although we referenced it. We also referenced the people module in our application module. And now if we remember, however, I told you that we need to explicitly declare what we export. We did only declare our people component, but we did not say what we are going to export. So let's define it here. So we create that export property on our ng module, and we reference our people component. Great, so let's save again. And now, luckily, yeah, perfect, it works. So it prints out that people works message, which is hard-coded, which has been generated by the Angular CLI. Awesome, so far so good. Let's now create something more interesting. So let's add some basic HTML here. Let's create a div. Then let's create an avatar. What we are going to do now is actually to create a simple widget that displays some profile information actually about a person. So here would be an image. Now I don't have any image at hand, so let's simply leave this empty. Let's create a section for the profile with the name. Let's add my name here. And well, let's also add some status message here. So you also see how automatically the website gets refreshed whenever we save that file. That's something the Angular CLI provides to us. So I'm currently coding on an Angular screencast. Now here further below we could add some information about the Twitter handle or website of the person. So let's add here a hyperlink to my Twitter profile, the URL here, and the Twitter handle. Great, and let's do the same for the website. So we get another span element, an href to my website. Let's directly reference the block here, and the name of the website. Oh, we missed here the href tag, the closing. Perfect. So if you save it, we should get something visualized there. Great, so it isn't obviously the nicest thing yet, because we didn't add any CSS. But if you remember, I told you that we can also associate styles to the component in the people component CSS here. So we will do that in a second. So let's add here a class just to make sure this works properly. Then let's go here to the CSS file. Now let's paste in some CSS which I created before, because I don't want to bother you with how I write those CSS files. Now let's save, and hopefully it should look a bit prettier. Well, actually somehow it does, but it's probably a bug again. Let's shorten up here that description. Now hopefully it should align better. And with some patience it loads up. Yeah, perfectly. That looks at least a bit nicer. Now what we could demo here is also the importing of an external package. So let's add some font awesome icons. So I switch back to the console. Let's terminate here our CLI server. And then let's use that npm install command for bringing in the font awesome package, which is named font awesome. Press enter. And this gets now downloaded from the external npm registry. and will be stored in our node modules folder. So in fact, if we ls into the node modules, we should see font awesome folder there, and probably has some CSS exactly here. Perfect. So let's take this one here and copy it. Now back into our project, at the very root you see a style CSS file, which are basically the global styles for our application. So for the sake of simplicity, let's simply import it here, store it. And now if you go back to the people component, we should now be able to use some font awesome classes. So let's add here an I class equals, then they are also prefixed always with FA minus Twitter. Let's close it up. And same thing, let's copy it here for the website. And here let's simply use the Chrome icon. Great, so we also obviously have to restart our web server. And now with some luck, it should visualize the font awesome icons. Awesome. Okay, perfect. So we're nicely set up. Now, obviously here we have all those hard-coded values, and that's obviously not something you're going to do in a real application. So let's add some dynamic behavior here. So we go back to our people component, and let's create here a people array, which holds the data which we are going to display. So what we do here is to create a class instance variable. So if you're programming Java or something, this might seem quite familiar. And then in the ng on init lifecycle hook, we create our array. Again, nothing special, just we replicate the structure which we have in HTML. Let's create a name property, and then here our status, currently coding. Then let's also add the object for the website and Twitter. So here we create like deeply nested objects, create a URL parameter here, urstr.com, and then the name. You could obviously make that more intelligent, parse it out, but for the example here, they should work quite fine. Let's also add the Twitter URL and also the name. Perfect. Great, let's save it up. Now we have the data ready now. What we need to do is to bind it to our HTML. So as you can see here, we have our hard-coded values. And a first attempt would be to replace those with the curly braces, which we have seen before, like name here. But obviously we have an array. So what we need to do is to replicate this whole part here for each entry in that array. And we can do that with a for loop or something similar. We can use that ng-for directive, which is an attribute on the HTML element we want to replicate. And then we can use that syntax like let person of people. And people, again, as you see, references that object in our class. And that person is basically a local variable. So we can use that within our template to here fill up and data bind our elements. Person status, and then here obviously we have to exchange the Twitter URL, person twitter.url, and also the Twitter handle, twitter.name. Same thing for the website. We have the person.website.url and also person.website.name. Great, so if we save it, it should hopefully work. The web server refreshes and the data is being displayed correctly. Now let's make it a bit more interesting. Let's add another record here. Let's add Rob Wormold, which is a developer advocate at the Google team. And what he does is for sure playing around with AOT. Then let's add here Twitter, because I actually don't know if he has a website, so let's leave that out. Rob Wormold, hope I spelled it right. Then name at Rob Wormold, the Twitter handle. Great, so let's save it. Now we should see two records here in our template. Yep, that works fine. But actually we get an error down here and it says cannot read property URL. Oh, that's because Rob Walmart doesn't have any website, or we didn't specify it here in our data structure. So we can prevent that. What we do is we use a similar directive here as the ng4, but this time the ngIf. And here we specify it should only be visible if that person.Twitter object is actually defined. Because if it's not defined, this will evaluate to false and therefore not show that enter HTML span here. So let's see, because that should resolve our error here. And in fact it does. It's also prettier because it doesn't show that symbol in front with an empty space. So yeah, that works. Great, so you see now we have already quite some HTML code here created. So this is a perfect moment for refactoring this into its own component. So again, let's fire up our terminal window here and use the CLI again. ngg component, people, and let's call it profile. So within that people module, we now create a profile component. So as you can see, we don't create another module because that's not needed, because this is simply another component within our module. So what's nice also is if you open the people module, our component already got referenced for us by the Angry CLI in the declarations section. We don't specify it in the export section because that's not something we want to export to the outside, because it's only something that lives within our module. And again, here the definition of our component. So we can now go back and copy this HTML part here, jump to the profile component, delete this out here, and paste the HTML code for the component, the profile here. Great. Now if you go back, we can start using actually our new profile component. Let's call that profile. Oh, and I think it prefixed our value. Let's jump back to the profile component here. And yeah, in fact, it adds that app prefix, which I don't like, so we'll remove it here. And we're done. Now, if we go back to the profile component HTML file, we actually see those references here to the person object. Well, also that ng4 here doesn't make any sense anymore. But also those person somehow has to be entered into that profile now, because at the moment we don't have it, and you see it also from the rendered page there. So we need to get it into our profile component. We can do that by using the input property here, or better said, the input decorator, and define here a person variable. So that person is the property that can be used to input values from the outside. We could also rename that by providing a string to the input decorator, but that's actually not suggested. Great, so now let's copy that ng4 over to our profile component. And now we need a new syntax, namely the square brackets, which are used for input properties. So as we have seen just a minute before, we specified that person input, and we now need to give it that person variable from our for loop. And we can now remove that whole HTML part here. And if we save, this should now work. So what happened here is we have that for loop, which has that local person variable, which we pass into our profile. Well, we forgot one thing, the CSS files. So this nicely also demonstrates how the CSS is scoped to a specific component, because it didn't actually work. So let's copy it over. And now it again works as expected. Great, so let's make it a bit more interesting here. We obviously want to be able to add new people to that list here. So for doing so, we create a new form. Let's remove that action here because we don't need it. Then let's create a div for separating the various controls. Let's add a label for the name of the person. Then we have an input field, which should also have a name property. In this kind, it's also name for the name of the person. Then let's copy that. We have the website. And well, in the case of the website, we have like two input fields, one for the name and one for the URL. That works as well. So then copy it over for the Twitter handle, Twitter, Again, these fields already fine. Oh, we forgot about the status. So let's add here another one and status. Okay. So it doesn't look actually very pretty. Let's also add an HR here below. And we also need some buttons for submitting our form. So we have the save button, which is of type submit. And then we have a cancel button. Great. Okay, so let's also add a button up there for adding a new person, which we'll then implement later. So it's not the nicest form in the world, but it should work for our demo here. Great. Now to add the form support in Angular 2, we first of all need to make sure that we have the forms model imported. So let's go to the package.json file. And we have to make sure that here the Angular/forms is already present, so that we have already installed external dependency. And we need to also make sure that in the people module, we got our forms module referenced. So we have to import it there from Angular/forms. And then declare it in the imports property here. Great, so once we have done that, we can go to the people component again. And there are different kind of ways how to create forms in Angular 2. So I've actually written an article on that. It is basically a first look at forms based on a webinar which Kara Eriksson did, which is a core contributor for the forms project within the Angular team. So we have basically the template-driven approach and the reactive or model-driven approach. And here I explain basically both of them. There are also plankers such that you can try it out by yourself. But anyway, in this example here, we will use the template-driven approach. And for doing so, this is quite simple. So we need to add the ng model attribute here on the input fields. And then to show what our form is data binding, let's create a local template variable. We do that with the hash in front. So like in this case here, ng form, which is built by Angular behind the scenes, will get attached to that variable hash f. And so we can now here below output the value that is bound to that form. Serializing values to JSON is really handy. So here you can nicely see where the binding works or where we have an issue. Now here you can see that we have the same name properties for the input fields, which is not right actually. But we also want the data from for that website to go into a sub-object, if you remember. We can implement that by using the ng model group. Let's specify the property website here, and then another one for the Twitter handle below here. And this way these properties, so name and URL for each respectively, will go into sub-objects. And you can also nicely see that here in our JSON structure. And also the data binding works just as we expect. Perfectly, so now let's submit that form. For submitting the form, we need to register on the event, and the events are registered with the round brackets, with the round braces, sorry. So we can use that ng submit event and then call a function on submit and pass in the value of the form. Now obviously that on submit needs to be implemented, and it needs to be implemented in our people component, so the component that the HTML part here belongs to. So further below here, let's create that on submit function, and we get here a new person. And what we do is simply to add that new person to the people array. So nothing fancy actually. Great, so I think this should already work. Let's see here, let's refresh. Now let's use .model for our example. .model is actually quite a famous person in the Angular community, and he has an excellent website which you should definitely visit. And if we save now, it should get attached to that array, and it works perfectly. We only used his last name as a status, but anyway, I think you get the meat here in this example. Great, so again, same thing as before. So there's quite some HTML here within our people component. And also this could be easily refactored into its own component. So again, let's use the CLI and create a new component. Let's call it this time new person. And you see it converts also the camel casing into a dash, so new dash person. So we see that new folder here. This is exactly the same case as for the profile, so we can simply cut this out. We go to that new person HTML, we deleted everything here and paste it in. And now we can go here. Oh, we need also to remove that prefix. We can go to the people component again and now include here our new person component. Great, so let's save. And again, we see that the form is displayed just as before. Now we need to go to implement that save button again, because if we go into the HTML part here, that NC submit function points to the onSubmit function, which now should be declared on the new person component, but it is actually declared on the people component, if you remember. So obviously in the new person component, we need to somehow implement that submit function. So we need to add it here. We got a new person. And now we need a way for like giving that new person back to the parent component, which is the people component. Okay. So we can do that with the output decorator. So similar as we did with the input previously, we now have an output. We add it here and we give it the name like unsubmitted. And what we do here is to broadcast events basically. So we have an event emitter of type any. We could here also introduce a person class with TypeScript, which I would definitely suggest in a real case example here. And we also need to import it from Angular core. And now we can go down here and use that unsubmitted output which we created and call the emit function and pass in a new person. Great. So now back to our person component. We can now, as before, register for that event. And as we learned, we used the round braces here. So we implemented unsubmitted and referenced it to the existing function unsubmit, passing in the $event. And the $event is basically passes on all the arguments that have been passed to that event, which in our case is a new person. So that should actually already work. Let's save all the files, because here we have already implemented it, so we should be fine. So let's save here the missing people component HTML file. Let's refresh. And now if we enter like here again, name.motto, it's also at his website. And if we save, it gets added just correctly here. So we don't see any Twitter handle here because we didn't enter that data. And it works. Okay, now we could make it a bit nicer. We'd actually add here a new variable, Boolean variable. So what I want to do now is basically to hide the form when we are not in this process of adding a new person and show it otherwise. And similar with this button, this should only be shown here if we are not in this adding new person phase. And we also need to accordingly set that Boolean here when we click the button. So we set it to the inverse. And now obviously the form here should be hidden. So we should also add an ngIf here. But in this case, we show it if this is adding new person is equal to true. And if you press the cancel button, it should be hidden. So let's take a look. And it works. So that cancel button obviously doesn't work yet, because here we would need another event, because the cancel button resides inside our component. So on cancel, when that on cancel is fired, we set it to false again. So we need to go into that new person, and as we learned before, we can simply create here a new output event, again using the event mirror. We need to instantiate that, and then further below here we define a new cancel function. And again here we basically invoke the on cancel event mirror and emit the new value. Here we don't have to pass any parameters. Now obviously that cancel function needs to be implemented, so it needs to be called when we press the button like this, and it should work. Great. So also here now on submit, we obviously set this to false because once we have submitted successfully, we want the form to disappear. And this should work just as we expect. With your top motto, if you save, it gets added. And also if you click the cancel button, the form closes just as before. Great. So now as the next step, obviously you don't want to have this hard-coded in your component, because the component's responsibility is actually to just do the visualization. So the data should come from another side. The logic should be implemented somewhere else. This is basically the responsibility of the services. So again, let's use the CLI to generate a new service in the people folder, in the people module. Let's call it people. And note that warning here. It says service is generated but not provided. It must be provided to be used. So let's remember this for a second, because we will need this later. Now if you open up the service that got generated, you see it's a simple ES6 class with an injectable attribute on top. And this injectable attribute on top basically tells the dependency injection mechanism that it should provide that class. What we want to do here is basically to add a new function. Let's call it fetch people. And we basically simply go back to the component. We take out that whole array here, cut it out, and we move it to the people service. So we paste it in here, and we simply return it for now. Okay, great. Now in the people component, we obviously now need to get hold of this people service. And in order this to work, we need to go to the people module, and that's actually what that warning said before. So we need to register that people service here explicitly, just like we do with the components actually. So we need to import first of all that people service. Here's the people service, and then we add it to the providers array here. Great, so let's save. We can now go back to the people component, and again we need to import our service here. Same thing from the people service. And in the constructor we then use the private keyword and the people service, which is of type people service. And this is to tell the dependency injection mechanism that it should provide us with an instance of that people service. That private is simply for associating the instance to our class. So that way we can then use the this keyword to access that service, invoke the fetch people function, and the result gets basically assigned to our people array. So if we save that and refresh our application, we actually see the list that gets again visualized. But now it comes from the service, and you can also see how the people component is now much cleaner and has less logic inside. Great. Now obviously in a real world scenario you are going to fetch the data from an API. So let's add here a people.json file and paste in basically the data for our people. And that JSON file gets delivered here at /assets/people.json. Okay, perfect. And now we should jump back into our people service, and we can directly go and invoke basically that endpoint. And for doing so, we need to import the HTTP service, which we get from Angular HTTP. And just same as before, we need to get it injected into the constructor. Now, similar as with the Angular forms module, we also need to make sure that we get the HTTP module. So we need to go to the package.json and verify that it got installed already. And we also need to make sure that the HTTP module actually gets loaded, in this case, for example, by the app module, and such that it is then available for the application. Great, so I think we should be able to use it now. We can use this.http.get, and we provide it with the path to that people.json file. And then we can use the map function for mapping basically the response to JSON. Now TypeScript here tells us that it doesn't have that function, which is totally right because we need to import it first. And we get that from Rxjs, so we invoke that add operator map, and now it works. Now Rxjs is heavily used within Angular, so I have written a blog post to get started with Rxjs, Rxjs is basically a library for processing streams, which follows the observer pattern, and it might be a bit scary initially to get started with, but I suggest you to get step by step. For instance, start with my article here and then learn about the concepts. The article also has a video attached and also very useful links at the very end of the article, which help you get started with Rxjs. There is obviously also the possibility to simply convert this HTTP, which by default returns such an Rxjs observable, to convert it to the promise, but I would highly recommend you to give it a try, because it is a really powerful concept once you get how it works. Okay, so here we need to simply return the result. And then obviously this here is no more synchronous. TypeScript also tells us that the observable is not assignable to the array. So we need to remove that here and use the subscribe function. And we get here the data, which we will then map directly onto our people array. There's also another way to make this look more synchronous by using async pipes, which is really powerful, but we won't go into the details right now. So this is something you can explore on your own. Okay, so now the data got served from the backend. Great. So you just created your first Angular application. Now let's quickly stop here and take a look what we did. So every Angular application is basically composed of such a component tree, how it is called. So if you did pay attention, what we did is basically create a top level component, which was the app root component. Then we created the child component, which was the people component. And from there we went on, like we created a new person component, the profile component, and you can imagine this could go on forever. So every application is structured in this way as a tree-shaped form. And this is very important because the whole data flow is based on that tree shape. So in this tree structure, we have so-called stateful and stateless components. The stateful components are those which usually get data from somewhere, from the outside, like a service. And the stateful components on the other side get their data via input or output properties. Now, in our case, for instance, we have our people service at the very top, which gets the data, for instance, from some remote source. It passes it to our people component, which then basically has those stateless components like the profile component and the new profile component, and passes the data in via those input properties, if you remember. Similarly, the data flows also back up again to the service, and that is done via the output properties and events. Now, we actually didn't pass the data back to the service, but imagine in a real world scenario, you would want to pass the data to a service which then invokes the backend for storing the data persistently in some kind of database. Great. So where to go from here? Now, Angular has a lot of other concepts, obviously. So what we did, for instance, today, we did take a look at the forms and the template-driven approach of creating those forms. But as I already mentioned, there is also the model-driven or reactive way of creating such forms. There is also the HTTP library, which has a lot of other features. Then there is the routing, which in a serious application you obviously need. And also other things like lazy loading and some stuff. Then you should also take a look at Rxjs programming, as we mentioned previously. It is a really powerful way, which is more and more used, and it is also a core concept within Angular applications. Then you might also need to take a look at tooling, especially at Webpack, because in this example here, we actually used the Angular CLI heavily, which abstracts away the whole tooling part, because it did already set up the whole bundling for us. It did set up the default structure and provides methods for generating code. But in a more complex scenario, you might have to take advantage of the underlying API, because internally Angular actually uses Webpack, which is a module bundler. And while Webpack is not necessarily known for having good documentation, but from some guys on Twitter, I know that they are currently working hard on the documentation for the new Webpack 2.0, which you can find at that webpack.js.org site. And they are for sure happy if you can provide them some help with creating the documentation, which is also a good occasion for learning it actually. And then Angular 2 is different. This is no more like a library or a framework, but the Angular team itself talks that it is more like a platform. So you can have Angular not only in the browser, But you can also develop desktop application with Angular by using Electron, or on the mobile you have different kind of choices, like you can use Ionic 2, native script, or also create the lately heavily pushed progressive web applications. And finally, you can also execute Angular on the server, which is mainly used, for instance, for pre-rendering your application for gaining more speed. Now, where can you learn all about those things? Well, personally, first of all, the Angular documentation is really good. So they improved it a lot compared to Angular 1. There are a lot of tutorials, cookbook articles, as well as the API documents itself. Then I would highly suggest you to read through blogs, like the Thoughtron blog is an excellent resource for Angular articles. Also, Todd Motto has quite good articles on his site. Then there's also Victor Safkin, which is a core member of the Angular team itself, which writes excellent posts, especially about the router. Well, and then I also have a blog where I write regularly about Angular 2 articles and also Angular 1. So if you're interested, check it out. I also highly suggest you to join the community on Twitter. There are awesome people which are really willing to help, even members from the core Angular team. You can write them questions and they will respond even to you. You can also follow me, so if I can help you, I will obviously respond. You have also the possibility to take a look at videos like this one, which you're currently just watching on YouTube. There are also excellent videos from the Angular Connect conference with talks from the Angular core members, which explain some fundamental concepts about Angular. Then there's Egghead.io, which has excellent videos, as well as Pluralsight. I also created a video course on learning Angular 2 directives with PackedPub, so you might want to check that out as well. And finally, check out Slack or Gitter and join the community there, ask questions or contribute. Great, so I hope you really liked that video. If you have any questions, obviously please let me know, give me feedback about the video, either on Twitter, at this Twitter handle, or simply check out my website and comment on some articles. See you.